Somewhere around 30,000 years ago, in the height of the Ice Age, some northern Asian tribes decided to undertake the perilous journey over the 600-mile land bridge that connected Alaska to Siberia. At the time, much of the world's water was locked up in ice, so these brave nomads didn't necessarily know they were migrating across continents into an undiscovered world. They followed the food and their instincts, and after some centuries, the land bridge melted, and they had populated large parts of Alaska, Canada, and all the way down into Central America. These were the early ancestors of the people we call Native Americans today. These hunter-gatherers would populate the land with autonomous nations, also known as tribes, for tens of thousands of years, until Christopher Columbus would arrive and change their fate forever. The groups that made it to South America had an entirely different historical trajectory, building advanced cities, developing writings, and becoming civilizations similar to what the rest of the world was doing. However, although varying in many ways, the nations of North America preferred a nomadic life connected to the land where they'd be as free as the breeze, drifting from place to place, and for the most part never settling too long in any one area. They must have had contact with the budding complex societies to the south, so why did they opt to stay this way? Well, who knows, but I think history has proven they made the right choice. Although much of the North American tribes did live completely nomadic, not all chose that path. Some opted for semi-nomadic lifestyles, building agricultural systems that were super advanced for the time. Some built urban centers and even partook in long-distance trade. A land so vast and diverse was sure to produce people who were the same. Anyway, it's hard to know the exact story of how these tribes progressed, but archaeologists have divided the time of North America pre-Europe into 5 stages. The Paleo-Indian Clovis culture, 40,000 to 14,000 BCE. The Dalton-Folsom culture, 8,500 to 7,900 BCE, the Archaic period, 8,000 to 1,000 BCE. The Woodland period, 500 BCE, 1100 CE, and the Mississippian culture, 1100 to 1540 CE. However, these dates are only estimations, and the characteristics of the tribes living in the Americas differed depending on location and choice of how they lived their lives. Some nations chose to remain in the woodland period, whilst others preferred to take on more agricultural and technological advances. Each nation paved their own path, and their cultures and societies developed accordingly. Even so, the earliest culture identified is the Clovis, so named for the Clovis points first discovered in Clovis, New Mexico in 1929. These points are crafted stone spearheads used primarily in hunting game, and once identified in New Mexico, were recognized in finds located across the continent. Although it does seem there are earlier cultures than the Clovis, this name is used to identify a widespread hunter-gatherer culture that survived primarily on hunting megafauna, large animals such as great bison, giant beaver, the mastodon, mammoth, saber-toothed tigers. But as the climate changed and more animals were hunted to extinction, larger game began to disappear and smaller game survived. At this point, the people began to gravitate toward permanent or semi-permanent settlements by lakes, streams, and rivers they could harvest for fish. The time after the Clovis we call the Dalton-Folsom culture. They get their name from the type of projectiles and tools they developed to hunt their new food sources. Due to disappearing megafauna, they had to adapt and would fish, forage, and hunt other animals such as deer. They developed stone knives and spear tips that they learned to hurl with a device called the atlatl, also known as the spear thrower, a very useful device that made hunting a lot easier. The Dalton-Folsom period was also where the first signs of religious beliefs based on the afterlife start to appear. By now we are still on prehistoric times, but after this the now natives of the land would develop into what we call the Archaic period and would make some significant advancements. A belief in a higher divine power defined the culture of the Archaic period, who are chiefly characterized by their construction of large earthen mounds, which have given them the epithet of mound builders. These mounds were initially created as sacred spaces where rituals were enacted, and may also have served as homes to the gods and to elevate the priest above the world of the rest of the community. The earliest mounds date to the so-called Middle Archaic period, primarily in modern-day Louisiana, specifically the Ouachita Mound at Watson Break, the oldest mound complex in North America. Mississippi and surrounding states, and sometimes seem to have become religious or political centers for the surrounding community. Permanent settlements were established at this time, and plants and some animals were domesticated. The dog was already domesticated by this time, and according to some scholars, traveled with the earliest arrivals from Asia. Small communities of the early and middle Archaic periods developed into larger cities by the late Archaic period, when sites such as Poverty Point in modern-day Louisiana were established. The Poverty Point site has given its name to the unknown people who constructed it, the Poverty Point culture. This site remained hidden from us until an aerial photograph was taken in 1953. A mystery for sure. Next, we have the Woodland period. Mound building continued and developed during this period, usually divided into early, middle, and late periods, a term which is usually associated with the eastern and middle regions of North America, but is equally applicable to the Southwest and Great Plains, in that similar advances were made across the continent. Ceramics became more refined, as did craftwork. In the Southwest, nations like the Hohokam built cities and designed efficient irrigation systems. In Alaska, the Inuit developed stone lamps, large fishhooks, better knives, and harpoons. Toward the east, individual nations built mounds not only as sacred places, but for burial and residential purposes, and each different group engaged in long-distance and local trade. They took an even stronger spiritual outlook on life, too. The Native Americans observed the religious belief of animism, the conviction that all things in nature are animated by a spirit and all are interconnected, and so recognized that the unseen world was just as real and powerful as the one they walked through in their daily lives. Mound building in general, it is thought, was a response to the unseen world, in that the forces of nature could be focused and perhaps controlled by centering them in a mound that raised the celebrants toward the heavens but kept them firmly connected to the earth. As mounds were often also raised by water, it is thought that all four elements of earth, air, fire, and water were celebrated and given thanks during mound rituals. The Mississippian culture is so called because the people primarily lived in the Mississippi River Valley, but they also established cities and villages in the Ohio River Valley, Tennessee River Valley, and elsewhere, ranging from the Northeast down to Louisiana and out toward Indiana. The Mississippian culture's best-known communities were the Adena culture, 800 BCE to 100 CE, and the Hopewell culture, 100 BCE to 500 CE, who built numerous mounds and further developed trade, commerce, craftworks, and technology. The Adena built cone-shaped mounds, while the Hopewells were more intricate, often in the shape of animals, but both served a religious function. As with Poverty Point, the mounds of the Hopewell culture can only be fully recognized and appreciated from above. Another nation, considered distinct from both the Adena and Hopewell, built the city of Cahokia in modern-day Illinois, the largest urban center in North America prior to the 18th century, which flourished between 650 to 1350 CE. Cahokia was a grand city with a wide central plaza, shops, ball fields, a solar calendar, residences for the lower class and others for the elite, and long fields of corn and other crops. The Moundville people maintained a strictly stratified social hierarchy, which they demonstrated through the architecture of the city. The wealthy lived in wooden homes on top of the mounds, which all faced the central mound in the plaza below, while the lower classes lived in thatch huts on the other side of the plaza. At some point, the city seems to have become a religious center and place of pilgrimage, as its population increased at the same time that artifacts suggest a greater frequency of religious rituals. While these Mississippian nations opted for a more sedentary civilization with construction and complex social hierarchies, it's important to note that the tribes more north and in other parts like the Great Plains tribes, which included the Comanche, Lakota, Apache, and other well-known nations, remained as nomadic peoples very closely connected to the earth that carried on hunting bison and following the herd all the way up until the point that Europeans arrived. Some agriculture was done, but these people preferred to live in temporary and mobile homes like teepees, whereas the Mississippian cultures of the South built houses and cities. No one knows exactly what factors influenced the different direction each nation took, but my personal theory is that the Mississippian tribes, being closer to their long-lost cousins that migrated into Meso and South America, adopted some of their culture and characteristics. Those cultures developed into grand, pristine civilizations with writing, social structures and monumental monuments, and buildings like the Step Pyramids and Nazca Lines. The societies of the southern cultures are intriguing and add another depth to the puzzle that was America pre-Europe. We recommend checking out the previous 2 parts of Legacy Unearthed, where we delve into those cultures. But anyway, we will wrap up this episode here. In 1541, the Spanish conquistadors arrived, and while the Mississippian culture was still flourishing, despite Cahokia being abandoned for some reason, some think because of overpopulation. It must have been an eerie sight for the Europeans, discovering deserted cities on this strange new continent. But the Spanish would look for gold in the south, killing many natives but not as many as the diseases they brought with them. The British tried a slightly more peaceful approach to colonization that failed many times until, with some help from native tribes, they managed to establish their first colony in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, also where the Pocahontas situation would arise. Check out our full video for more information on that. And by 1620, there were a variety of thriving New England colonies. The French chose to establish themselves in Canada, and due to the large presence of Europeans on the land, vast numbers of the native population would die due to disease and wars. The British were having the most success at establishing colonies in North America and were at war with both the Spanish and the French. The Spanish, combined with the Portuguese, opted to spread their presence further south instead, and although there was some Dutch influence, the British would slowly begin to incorporate most of North America into their empire. One of the reasons the Europeans were so successful was due to allegiances forged with local tribes that already harbored resentment and ill will to other tribes. This divide and conquer tactic would be used throughout the Americas, and after their use of whichever group was aiding them was finished, they'd break whatever treaty or alliance was promised and proceed to steal as much land as they could to establish total European control. In modern-day USA, as more and more Europeans came to the new land of opportunity, they pushed native tribes further and further into the interior and western parts of the country. There were resistance, most famously by the natives in the Anglo-Powhatan Wars of 1610-1646, and then the King Philip's War of 1675-1678, and many others up through the 18th century and into the 19th. But a lack of cohesion and unity on their part, coupled with the seemingly unending supply of immigrants the English were able to send against them, eventually led to their defeat. By the late 19th century, most Native Americans were confined to reservations, and the immigrants, having stolen their lands through treaties that were never honored, then settled into their new home and named states, provinces, rivers, and parks after the people who had once owned everything. A sad end to such a vibrant, diverse, and unique society that remained untouched from the influence of the wider world for over 40,000 years.